Welcome to Climate Action. My name is Arun Kelshiker. It gives me great pleasure to speak to the High Commissioner for Antigua and Barbuda, Karen-Mae, OBE. Karen was the first Antiguan to win a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford and is also a qualified barrister and, among other accolades, also the founder of the Antigua and Barbuda Youth Symphony Orchestra. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you, Arun.
Could you share more about Antigua and Barbuda and your mission as High Commissioner, please?
Antigua and Barbuda is one of the smallest of the English-speaking Caribbean countries, and it's one of the countries that has suffered most, I would say, from climate change within the last 30 years. Several major climatic events, hurricanes, in recent years, heat waves, have really impacted Antigua, but it's still a place where we celebrate sand, sea, sun, and culture.
As we turn to climate change, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, shared a stark warning earlier this month, saying the target of limiting long-term global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius is hanging by a thread, and the battle for 1.5 degrees will be won or lost in the 2020s, under the watch of leaders today. How is the climate crisis impacting Antigua and Barbuda and other small island developing states? What are the biggest challenges facing SIDS and small island developing states because of the climate crisis?
That is such a powerful question, Arun, because we see ourselves, SIDS, very much the frontline victims of our climate change. First, we speak about extreme weather events. One that comes to mind immediately is Hurricane Irma in 2017, which had sustained winds that were higher than even the classification that hurricanes are measured by, that battered our sister island, went on to batter other Caribbean islands and causing hundreds of percent of GDP worth of damage for our island states. That's bad enough. But after that happens, we're then told that we don't qualify for concessional financing to rebuild. So you may have damage 100% of your GDP, 200% of your GDP wiped out in a few hours. And then you're told by the same international community, many of whom are the funders, bigger funders of development assistance, big emitters of pollution, you don't qualify for assistance. Then thirdly, they always compete in things. This is a world that is riddled, sadly, with too many things that draw the attention, that require resources, and we tend to get left behind. Because I primarily say this is the reason why. We sell sand, sea, and sun. We are small island developing states. We are ocean states. We tend to operate within particular spheres of the beautiful tourists. And people forget that behind the sand, sea, and sun are realities that need to be addressed. And for a fraction of the cost that's spent on weapons, could actually transform our nation states into resilient, self-sufficient entities.
You brought up some really important key points there, Karen, and it sort of also talks about climate justice as well. And climate justice, simply put, is basically supporting the most vulnerable people and places facing most dramatic impacts of the climate crisis, while considering those countries that were most responsible for those historic emissions. Developed nations have contributed around 80% of historic emissions, while SIDS, small island developing states, in stark contrast, have contributed less than 1% to global emissions. Least developed countries and small island developing states are on a quest for climate justice. Can you share how small island developing states are managing climate change? What actions are being taken internationally?
You know, Arun, I think it's important that we never see SIDS as just hapless victims of fortune. SIDS are also agents in the process of responding to climate change. And let me give just a few quick examples. The COP meetings, SIDS mobilize, whether at the level of AOSIS at the United Nations or through the Commonwealth, we come together. And there is this united voice calling on our bigger brothers and sisters around the world to respond to recognize the challenges that SIDS face with respect to climate change and take action. So that happens in terms of mobilization. Antigua has taken some other bold steps. I particularly a case with my Prime Minister, Honorable Gaston Brown, along with Tuvalu, brought before the International Tribunal on the Law of the Seas, where we asked for an advisory opinion on whether there's a legal basis for countries that are emitters of pollution to have a legal and moral obligation to compensate the victims of that. That advisory opinion was released just a few weeks ago, and it suggests that there is indeed a legal and a moral obligation so to do. So the next steps there will be how will we apply that advisory opinion. Again, I stress advisory, but certainly it's a compelling first step towards getting a legal basis for the situation that we face. But we're not just, as I said, agents of climate change or victims of climate change. We are also actors in our own space. So in Antigua, for example, we were the first to ban single-use plastic bags. We work with our hotels on the Green Fin initiative to ensure that we have reef-safe sunscreens and people understand as tourists how to look after the marine environment. We have always been a country that believed that we are not just to sit back and allow bad things to happen, we have to engage. And one final thing I'll say on this is that the question of access to finance is perhaps one of the single greatest challenges we face. Because we're SIDS, we have small economies that tend to be homogenous, 80% of GDP, 60% GDP is tourism-based. So when something like that happens, a hurricane, a pandemic, you literally have your economy shut down. And if you can't access the finance to rebuild, or you don't have the resilience to quickly rebuild, then you can't. So we have also been forefront in promoting the Vulnerability Index the initiative, both at the UN and the Commonwealth, where we're saying to our developing partners, the OECD, to the EU, to the G7, look, wait a minute. You can't just use GDP per capita to determine that we are high income or ineligible, because it's not a correct meter. You have to look at resilience. You've got to look at vulnerability. And when you look at those factors in SIDS, you will see that we lack resilience, we're inherently vulnerable, and this existential threat that climate threat poses means that there is a different obligation that applies to SIDS as it applies to other parts of the world. So I hope that helps a little bit in giving perspective of what we are doing and how we are leading the charge as a small state.
No, indeed, Karen, and thank you for sharing that. And it sort of reminds me of how, historically within context, we thought about the basically the commitment from developed nations in 2009 to commit a minimum of 100 billion per year towards addressing the climate crisis. And if you take the estimates from any wide variety of estimates from Oxfam through to the OECD, developed nations have fallen very short of meeting those commitments as well. Moving forward from there, thinking about obviously peace, global peace, peace one day, and climate and the relationship with climate. For you personally, no climate action, no peace. When we think about that, what comes to your mind?
No climate action, no peace. Because the reality is that if we are displaced from our lands, from our customs, from our whole geographical space, you're then unleashing climate refugees around the world. And as we can see in the narrative that's happening now in parts of the world, including where I am right now in Europe, there is growing public unease with uncontrolled things like migration. People have legitimate concerns about how their borders can be respected. And we're seeing now a pushback, even in the politics. So people are responding to these sorts of things. We don't want to be the next wave of climate refugees. We want to actually be self-sufficient, resilient island nations who can actually support the world. When these things happen, everyone suffers because resources are pulled in all directions. They're used now to support this, and it means that someone else gets left behind. But if we can find a way where we can help people to remain productive within their own environments, moving not because they're being forced, but because by choice they've chosen to migrate and they're welcome where they go. The resources that we have, and let me be clear on this, I will never suggest to the G7 countries, for example, that they have limitless resources. No one does. But what I'm saying is what we do have, if we can use it in a far smarter way to help build resilience within island states, within LDCs, within vulnerable landlocked countries, we then stop this rot of how do we then make the dollars that we do have spend? How do we build harmony? Because what we're seeing in the world suggests to me that we are having more people annoyed, irritated, within even developed countries, people who are not wealthy, getting angry about what they think is their tax dollars supporting other people. A fraction of those tax dollars, better deployed within those countries to build capacity, to build resilience, would actually give us the peace that we're looking for.
And you've really highlighted some key points there, Karen, and even this idea of some of the poorest countries in the world having the highest cost of debt currently, which is something which is highly questionable, highly debatable, and needs urgent action to address that.
And I'll say one more thing, if I may, around the SIDS. SIDS control 19% of the world's ocean space. That's a resource. And that resource itself can be better, I think, exploited and understood. The blue economy that we've spoken about a few times, Arun, around how we unlock that potential for SIDS. This is not a call for money. This is not a call for someone to get to their treasury and print bills to give to developing countries. There is that, money is needed. But how do we also unlock the productive capacity of SIDS, especially the large ocean state SIDS that we all are part of? So I want it to be a two-sided conversation, the need, but also the solution that exists within the resources that SIDS already have. And if we can unlock that to feed the world's food security, to strengthen our economies, everybody wins.
No, indeed, absolutely. And just to put it into context for people thinking about the ocean economy, if it was a country, it would be in the G7. Yes. So that's the extent of the asset base and the productivity around the ocean economy. Karen, looking forward, how can people support your mission, the mission of SIDS and other countries around the world? How can they make the most impactful contributions?
Oh, that's such a wonderful question to ask, and at so many levels people can help. But I think the single most important way that people can help is to invite people around the table for dialogue. And I've seen pockets of this throughout the world, and I want to commend many organizations, whether it's the UN, the Commonwealth, where there's a voice for young people, disabled persons, gendered responses to climate change. SIDS being invited around the table. One of the best things that could ever happen, and should always happen, is to say to people, let's hear what the SIDS themselves are saying. Let's bring them into the conversation, because we're not in the corridors. When the OECD meets, when the IMF meets for its whatever, where the decisions are taken, we're not always around the table. But let's create a space where we can actually be invited around the table so our voices are heard. And when that voice is heard, we hope we can get the media to get involved. Not just with the things the media wants to peddle, sensational stories and big headlines, but the media helping us to get that message out there about the agency of SIDS, about the value of SIDS, and about the capacity of SIDS to be architects of global security, especially the area of food security in the blue economy. So I think I want to call on people just to listen more, get SIDS involved at all levels, and let's broaden the dialogue consistently in the interest of everybody around the table.
No, absolutely. It's a global call to action. High Commissioner, thank you very much for taking the time for our conversation.
I loved it. Thank you very much, Arun. Thank you.